Hello, welcome back to What is This Weapon? And some of you might know, if you came to our exhibition, our temporary exhibition Reloaded, a little while ago now, you will have seen this monster on display there. Prior to that, it was on display in our hunting gallery, and right out the gate, let me, as if you hadn't guessed, let me just reveal, this is in fact, on the face of it, a hunting rifle. It is a gigantic rifle. 2-bore, but it gets complicated. We'll get into that in just a little bit. So I'm going to struggle to wrangle this thing for the camera, but we'll come in close and get you some nice shots of it. Kind of an intriguing piece. This was commissioned by us when we were a bit flush, I guess. Such custom top-end sporting guns are not cheap. We had a run of commissions at the Royal Armouries. Another one was, if you go to the Tower of London, you will see our Tiffany revolver, which is a really stunning piece. A modern Magnum revolver, browned with gold, gun-making tree wood leaves all up the sides of it. That's another one. This was another, and it was commissioned for the Millennium, and we call it the Millennium. In fact, we call it the Millennium Gun. On the top of the barrel, it says Millennium Rifle, which we'll show you a shot of. So I need to re-educate myself to call it Millennium Rifle. Strictly speaking, a gun, well, strictly speaking, gun just means a tube closed at one end that shoots a projectile. But in many spheres of gun world, it means a smooth bore firearm. Or an artillery piece if you're from the artillery world. But anyway, rifle, you can't go wrong. This is definitively a rifle. So, Millennium Rifle. So that meant it was commissioned in the 90s. And due to the very long lead time on this kind of custom work, and I guess the fact that we weren't in a gigantic rush, this was finished in 2009 and delivered in 2011. The story actually begins in the early 1990s with the maker, Giles Whittam. His name is on the top of the gun, which we'll show you this very nice inscription, one of many very nice things about this gun. He is a former managing director of Sterling Armament, interestingly enough. So there's a connection to other parts of our collection there. He's a former big game hunter and a gun writer, author, researcher as well. So various things going on in his life. But he ended up running his own gun-making company, employing other people, a couple of which were involved in the making of this, which we'll mention again as we go. The inspiration was another piece from the Royal Armouries collection, which is a unique, I'm told, 1868 Alexander Henry falling block harpoon gun, not a sporting rifle, but the same action. And we'll get into that very soon as to how this actually works. So Mr. Whittam had already built at least one 4-bore rifle using this dropping block action, which is extremely strong, as you'll see in a moment why it was chosen. And he wanted to sort of up the ante and produce a 2-bore rifle. Now, I believe we ended up with at least one other, well, there is at least one other, the Tyrannosaurus rifle, which is also the same basic plan as this, 2-bore, and has a gold T-Rex on the side of it. And there may be one other in the series. Now, I suppose they could have just taken the very strong action and gone very modern with this, but I think that the market for that would be even smaller than the market for such a great big and expensive firearm as this. So they kept it very traditional. You know, a late Victorian shooter would perhaps see nothing different about this. They'd be amazed by it, obviously, in various ways, but it's very faithful to those old school big game rifles. Now, the other thing that helps with recoil is the sheer weight of the gun. So this is almost 25 pounds, 11.8 kilos is what I just now weighed it at. Ever so slightly less than that, because this actually has a snap cap round in it, which you'll see when we open the action. But in that ballpark. And the inertia of that helps keep the gun in place, in space, as it were, for a little bit longer before it whacks you in the shoulder. It's necessarily going to be big and heavy because you need a big, thick-walled barrel to contain the pressure, of course, and a great big breech block, and therefore a receiver to house it. So the weight stems from the necessity of the design, but it certainly does help soak up that felt recoil as well. The other more minor consideration, and you might not think it if it happened to you, is that there's no checkering. Quite deliberately, there was no checkering applied where you would normally want it for gripping the firearm, because that will move in your hand and really hurt, actually. If you've ever fired a Magnum revolver with a checkered grip, you'll know what I'm talking about. So that's deliberate. It also gives it quite a different aesthetic and lets you see the lovely sort of figuring in the detail of the wood, the grain, the different colours, which still looks very nice on a checkered stock, but you can see it even more plainly without the checkering. So how does this work? Well, external lock, external hammer, old school. On half cock, I just then prop it up. We might have to come at this from a different angle to show you close up. We have a button on the back of this underlever, press that in to release it, and then the block drops down. Really, really slick, smooth action there. I'll try and show you that on camera. So that just drops straight down. Sometimes people will call the Martini Henry a dropping block. That's more of a tilting block. This is a pure dropping block. And then at the right at the bottom of travel, gigantic sort of two-horn extractor pops out, a bit like the Martini actually, and lets you, in this case, extract. Slightly awkward, don't want to damage any woodwork. But there is a channel cut. This is just a snap cap to save the firing pin. There's a channel cut in the wood so that you have the space necessary to insert the round and, of course, to eject the case. So that's designed in there. And there's just a huge gaping black hole of a breech there. So we close that up. And let me just give you an idea of how. So this is an inert round, fired primer, no content, but the 2,500 grain projectile, which is a lot of grains. So you can see that will come in from behind the hammer, of course, slide in, close it up, and the breech block will come up behind it. And I don't want to damage the head of that display round, so we won't put that all the way in, but you get the idea. This, incidentally, is exactly why double rifles were invented, because this is slow to reload. And if you have a large beast charging at you, 2 shots seems like a good idea, albeit it makes the whole gun a lot heavier. And my arm's getting tired, so let's close this back up. So that's the action, which is, this is quite understated, not as a gun, but as a decorated gun. So we just have some beautiful engraving on the sides of the action, both sides the same, just leaving a panel of steel. There's nothing in the center of there. There is the tang, which is at the bottom of the loading channel essentially, is also nicely decorated with foliage, really quite intricate. The great big screw that secures the tang, and therefore the action, in place, or the barreled action, is a very, very bright peacock blue, almost like a mirror finish, and then the pin at the back of it is the same. So just 2 little bright blue highlights. Can't help but be reminded of RoboCop 2 with his blue body, I guess it is, which is completely inappropriate for this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Now that one's the most obvious because it's got the most surface area, but there's a lot of highlighting with that peacock bluing. But basically any screw or pin is peacock blued. So the 2 on the top, there's 1 on this side, the left side, the 2 side nails that hold the lock on, back action lock, by the way, is the term for a lock that has the plate substantially behind the hammer, which you need for an action that's in front of it. You can't have a traditional, well you could integrate it into the side, but this is a traditional way of doing it. But these four pins here that are part of the lock mechanism, of course. Normally, you would try and gloss over those, make them flush and invisible, or you might do a little bit of decoration to sort of highlight them instead. Here, those are little dome-headed pins that are peacock blued, and the screw that holds on the hammer is also peacock blued and decorated with engraving. And then underneath, so the great big pivot pin, that's also blued in the same way. Another pin there, the two screws on the tang underneath. So it's not, there's a lot of decoration on this thing, but it's not kind of overwhelming. It's not trying to upstage the fact that it's a gigantic cannon. The bluing, the main bluing, is just a beautiful mirror polish blue. The kind of star of the show in a way for us are two things. Firstly, the top of the barrel that I mentioned, as well as proclaiming that it's the Millennium rifle and it's by Giles Whittam, our logo is actually engraved on the top of the barrel as well. And then the other big deal is back here. So on the top of the receiver here is a rendition of the horned helmet of Henry VIII. Still the logo for the Leeds site, although not in this form. This is a very sort of naturalistic, artistic, three-quarter angle view of that helmet. Very, very well executed. So those two things tie this to us, even if you didn't know the history of the piece. Now, having mentioned the decoration, I'd be remiss in not mentioning the engraver on this gun, which was Sean Banks, a name that will mean something to those of you who are aware of high-end sporting guns. And I should also mention the maker of the action, who was Don Custerson, both men working with Giles Whittam, of course. So I really need to talk about caliber, or bore. Essentially balls to the pound, for those of you who aren't aware or haven't really thought about it. Bore in the UK, gauge in the US. A more technically correct way to say it would be the gauge of the bore. In fact, historically, British people did use the word gauge. I don't want to start a flame war in the comments, but both terms are valid, and yet at the same time, neither is quite technically correct. But anyway, we know what we mean when we say bore here in the UK and gauge in the US. So it's the diameter of the bore, the inside of the barrel, expressed as how many lead balls you would get to the pound. So a 12 bore, you'd get 12 balls of that size would make up a pound of lead. Which means, in theory, a 2 bore ought to be half a pound of lead, but it isn't. If you do the conversion, we'll maybe do it on screen for you. 2,500 grains, which is what the projectile is. Yes, it's longer than a sphere, so there's more mass than if it was just a sphere. That's still not 2 bore by weight. So there's more going on here. So this was proved as a 2 bore. In fact, our display cartridge here, as well as RAM for Royal Armouries Museum, has a 2 on it for 2 bore. It was described as a 2 bore by the maker, marketed as such to the other, at least one person that has bought one of these. It's a 2 bore, nominally, except when you measure this gigantic bore between the grooves, which is the way to do it, it's 1.052 inches, which is bang on a 4 bore. So is it a 2 bore or is it a 4 bore? Well, what might help is if I show you this vintage 4 bore sporting rifle. It's a double rifle. Considering it's a double rifle, it's not much heavier, if at all, than this thing, which is interesting. Anyway, this belonged to a famous big game hunter called Hewitt Grogan, who is quite a character. Maybe a story for another day. But this is described by him and by others as a 4 bore, and if you measure this is on the very low end of the bracket of what you could legitimately call a 4 bore, if you're going by the strict diameter or by the spherical ball of lead that it would fire if it fired a spherical ball, that's redundant, of lead. So it's complicated. So that means that rifles like Grogan's, described as a 4-bore, well, this one at least, is a lot closer to a 5-bore, i.e. a smaller caliber. The lower the number, the bigger the bore. Hence 2-bore is gigantic, 4-bore less so, 12-bore normal. So the actual ballistics of this, as I've said, 2,500 grain bullet, 16 drams of black powder, and that gives you about 1,250 feet per second velocity, which is very low if it was a small bullet, but very high for such a gigantic one. And that equates to 8,675 foot-pounds as a measure of muzzle energy. We could throw up joules on the screen for you as well. That's a ton of muzzle energy. Now that, of course, is, to put it bluntly, all about putting holes in very thick skulls, because these things were designed originally for big game. Elephants, rhinoceros, that kind of thing.
Okay. And hold it tight into the shoulder. Don't let it work up kinetic energy. Lovely.
So that's it. It's quite a simple gun. One barrel, one lock, one breech mechanism, single shot, slow to load, incredibly powerful, borderline impractical. I think there's a reason why this isn't made as a true 2-bore, because almost no one's ever made a true 2-bore. It would be even bigger and heavier than this and completely impractical. Designed in theory for killing elephants, but I'm quite a fan of the fact that this one never has and never will. Now that's not to say that this will never be fired again, because when this was supplied, a couple of live rounds were supplied with it, which are in the ammunition collection. So it's not impossible that one day somebody at the Royal Armouries could shoot this thing. I'm just not convinced that I want it to be me. Thanks for watching, guys. We really appreciate it. As always, check out our website, our social media channels, and especially if you'd like to see these videos without adverts and a whole load of other content from other historic firearms creators, do check out History of Weapons and War. It's an app that you can pay a monthly fee for, and you'll see a load of cool channels there. The full version of some content and without any ads as well. So do check that out. We'll continue to be free here with the ads. Also, development, we have some extra merchandise in the shop. This rather beautiful pin here that I'm wearing, I'm sporting, is taken from our baby Browning, our Art Deco baby Browning that was in our Reloaded exhibition, and we hope to get back on display at some point soon as well. One of our star exhibits, and just a really nice thing, hence I'm wearing it. Key rings as well. There's a golden AK and possibly more coming that I'm not aware of. But check out our shop in general, and we might even put a link to this in the video. But whatever you do, come back and see us again next week.